In this video, we're going to complete the implementation of our update profile in our student controller, as well as implement um, loading data from our model into the view and then capturing those changes on form submission from our view back into our HTTP post action for update profile. If you're needing details on how we get to this point, I'd recommend going back and watching previous videos um, for this week, and then coming back to this once you've gotten through those additional steps. Now, to update the profile, the first thing we're going to need to do is we'll need to capture the user logged in, and then from there we'll have to retrieve the student from the database, and then pass the student object to the view for binding. So what I've done is, in order for us to actually capture and store the user who is authenticated, in my login HTTP post action, I've added one line that says authenticate user, which basically says forms authentication, which is a static, or it's a class, and it has a static method called setAuthCookie, and I'm passing in the email address of the user that I want to say is logged in, and then I'm setting these to persist the cookie to false. So basically that says that this is the user that's logged in, and once they close their browser and in their browser session, log the user out automatically. So this will ensure that we have a user that is logged in. And then the update profile, the first thing that I want to do then is I want to go to my context. And the context will be off of this .http context.user, and off of user we'll grab the identity and the identity name. So this will be a string that will be the email address of our user, and then we need to retrieve that user from the database. Now to do that, under login we used our repo variable, which is a repository, and then we're using our repository engine to get the repository for iStudentRepository. So we're using that reflection engine to resolve our dependency for an iStudentRepository instance or class, which we created that's under our models folder called Student Repository. So the repository engine will get us an instance of iStudentRepository and return it to us. Again, just to highlight, in the textbook that goes along with this course, there is a section of a chapter that talks about Ninject, and Ninject is one of these dependency injection frameworks. For this, I went ahead and actually kind of pseudo created my own just to demonstrate the mechanics of what these injection frameworks are actually doing. So we'll use our repo variable, and we'll say repo.getAllStudents, and then we'll say where s for student, so student.emailaddress equals email address, and I'm going to capture this as a student stu, and I only need the first or default that comes back from that query. So let's then assume that if stu does not equal null, that means we have a student. We'll go ahead and we'll pass that student to the view. Else, if we end up with no student, we'll throw some sort of new application exception, invalid student found. And then maybe we can put in here email address just to kind of identify who the user is. So we'll do an F6, and that will do our build. Now we have that update profile screen that we created last time, so what we should be able to do now is if we F5 and run this, we can actually navigate to student/update profile and hit enter, and what will probably happen is we should get an error saying that the user does not exist, so we haven't logged in yet, so invalid student found. So first we'll have to do a login, and we'll log in with our test case. So we're now logged in, and then we'll go to update profile again, and we're still receiving an error. So let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here and here, and let's kind of debug through this. So we'll hit OK, we'll load again, and we jump straight to the end. And it still says invalid student found. Let's go ahead and hit continue. And alright, so under our HTTP context, user identity, name, our name is coming back empty. So our set auth cookie is not actually storing our authentication cookie. So what's happening is that we're not getting a name here inside of our user identity. Now the reason for that is that we are setting an auth cookie, but we're not telling ASP.NET to actually go in and retrieve that cookie and pack it into the HTTP context. So the approach we're using is classic forms authentication, which has been replaced with a concept called OWIN. OWIN is currently kind of beyond the scope of this lecture, and frankly it's a very new technology, so it's somewhat beyond the scope of this course. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go into our web config, which is located under our Solution Explorer at the bottom of our project, and underneath the system.web element I'm going to add authentication mode equals forms, and by setting this authentication mode to forms, that will actually take care of ensuring that the user gets retrieved from the cookie. So we'll go ahead and hit run, and we will go ahead and log in again with our student. And then we will navigate to student/update profile. And looking in our debugger now, we actually receive our full username or email address in this case, which is gantoka@ucmail.uc.edu. If we go ahead and continue through this code now, we come to the update profile screen. So we have our first name, our last name, our email address. The password comes through as blank, and the mailing address is also blank. So what we can do here is we can set this to 123 Main Street. And the idea here is that we would capture this form submission within an action and then update the database with the updated information. Now, if I hit save, what will happen is we will basically just post back to the same action. So this action is not identified as being either a get or a post action, and because of that, it will handle both get and post requests. So I'm going to go ahead and stop, and I'm going to start by putting HTTP GET attribute on top of the update profile. I'm going to do an F6 to recompile, F5 to run, and I'll just go ahead and reload this form again. And if I say 123 Main Street and hit save, we will actually end up with a 404. Now the reason we're getting a 404 is because that submit button does a post back to update profile, and that post is not currently being handled by an action. The only action we have is a get. So we actually need to define a second action method called update profile, and we'll say update profile, and then we're going to receive a student parameter. Now within this we can say repository update student, and then ultimately we will save changes and then do some sort of post probably back to the student list. Now since student list is becoming very popular, I'm going to go ahead and before we implement the update profile, I'm actually going to go ahead and create an HTTP GET action for student list. And this will be very simplistic. It will simply just be this line of code here. Now, because we've created an action, we can come here and we can say redirect to action, and then we can give the name of the action, which is student list. Also, previously, this string student list pointed to a view that would list students, but now since the view and the action name are the same, we can drop the string, which is the view name, and it'll be inferred by the action name. Alright, so the last step is for us to kind of get everything cleaned up, and then we'll implement update profile. So I'm going to work from the bottom up just because, well, being at the bottom is easier. So we're going to say return, redirect to action, and we'll redirect to student list. That line also needs a return. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to say repo.updateStudent, and we're going to pass in the new student that we received. Now, before we do that, we need to say if model state dot is valid. Now, that's our model validation. If our model state is valid, then we will go through these steps. Else, we'll return the view with the student data. Now, the repo update student actually is going to take care of doing the update and the saving changes. Now, we may have to jump back into the update student implementation to make sure that it's complete, but these 2 lines of code should be all we need to actually update our student from our form submission. So let's jump over to models real fast in student repository, and let's open up update student and see what's inside. So we have DB student, which is pulling the student from by student's ID, and then we need to do some mechanics here of copying properties. So the basic mechanics here would be db student dot, and we can just kind of work our way from the top. Email address equals student dot email address. db student dot first name equals student dot first name. db student dot ID obviously will skip. Last name equals student dot last name. db student dot mailing address equals student dot mailing address. And then db student dot password equals student dot password. And db student dot student ID equals student dot student ID. So then we'll have our context do an update, set it as modified, we'll save changes, and that should take care of our submission back to the database. So we'll go ahead now and we will run. And we will actually go to student/update profile. We should still be logged in. And we'll set our mailing address to 123 Main Street. I'm going to jump back to Visual Studio. And whenever I'm working on new code, I always like to just put some breakpoints and walk through and make sure that things are executing as I would expect. So I'm going to jump into the student controller, and I'm just going to put a breakpoint right here for model state is valid. So then we'll jump back to the code, we'll hit save. Visual Studio is flashing, so that means our breakpoint was hit. Our model state is valid, so inside of student we should have email address, first name, there's the ID, last name, there's the mailing address that we added, the password is null, and the student ID is 98765. So the data from our form submission made it all the way back. So that's great news. So now we will go ahead and we'll step over, and now we'll step into the update student method, which will jump us into the student repository class, update student method. We can then walk through and say db student. We have a db student object now. And we can just do these property copies. We'll set it state to modified. And we get one error here stating that the additional information in an object with the same key already exists. So what we've done is we're attempting to duplicate student, which came out of our form submission, and duplicate it within the context, which is not what we want to do. We actually want to update DB student. So we'll replace student with DB student here. Now this is Entity Framework. I'll be perfectly honest. I spent about a week back in November, just really every day, 8 hours a day, learning Entity Framework. Nose to the grindstone, looking at websites, tutorials, videos, blogs, just anything and everything I could find just to get myself up to speed on Entity Framework. So that was probably somewhere between 25 and 35 hours that I spent in 1 week trying to get myself competent in the Entity Framework. It is very big, it is very complex, and it is very powerful all at the same time. So if these two lines of code don't make a lot of sense to you, frankly, I'm not surprised. The best thing I can recommend, again, Entity Framework is somewhat beyond the scope of this course. So take what you see here at face value and do your own research. That's the best thing I can tell you. As with any new technology, the best thing you can do is just research until you find that you've either comprehended or absorbed enough information where you can start to at least understand what's happening and be able to either troubleshoot through things or, if nothing else, be able to ask good questions. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll run again. And we'll jump to student/update profile. And we'll set this to 123 Main Street, and we'll hit save, and our breakpoint should get triggered. Our model state is still valid. We will step down, and we just stepped over. So that's a good thing. That means we didn't error out on our student repository down here. So these changes should have taken place successfully. Before we redirect, let's go ahead and jump into our students table and say show data to see if our changes actually did commit. And there is 123 Main Street. Our password did get reset to null, so we'll have to do some work there to handle that. But it looks like our update did take place, so if we go ahead and continue, we should get redirected to the student list action, which will then give us a list of all students. Great. So we made good progress. So let's go ahead and jump in, and our edit is not currently implemented. We actually need to make some modifications to this view, but we'll go ahead and go back to update student profile, and I'll again set the password to password. We'll hit save. We'll step over. This time we'll step in. We'll step over. So now DB student should be set to the appropriate values, and there's our password of password now in the DB student. We'll set that state to modified, and then we'll tell it to commit those changes. And now we have a password. So all of our pieces are functioning accordingly. We're getting data in and out, back and forth from our view to our model, our view to our controller. Our controller is updating through our repository, and we have a fully closed loop.